native plants, seed, and trees. And I just wanted to thank Lori for letting me present my ideas at the Pollinator Summit. I think a lot of these are a bit conceptual, but I think it's going to help you guys in your restoration projects to kind of understand some of the integrated pest management concepts and to come away with a more successful and more resilient and functional native landscape. So I just wanted to note that my ideas are stemming from natural communities in and around the Chicago area, probably several hundred miles. And a lot of the species probably overlap with the people in this meeting. I just wanted to note that there may be some slight differences, but in any case, I do believe that the concepts apply and the application applies. So let's get on to the presentation. So first, I want to take us on a journey back in time to 1835 and before. So if you've got your flux capacitor handy and you've got 1.21 gigawatts ready to go, let's take a journey back in time. So to get you in this mindset, imagine sitting exactly where you are, but swipe away your desk, swipe away your computer, and swipe away the building that you're in right now. So visualize a prairie. Where you're standing was likely a prairie back in 1835. So where you look out, you can see seas of wildflowers and grasses and wetlands. In the middle ground, you might see an oak savanna dotting the landscape. And in the far distance, you may see an oak woodland grading down to a stream. So in 1835, we are here before much of the modern day quote unquote progress happened. So we have virtually intact landscapes from horizon to horizon. Not to say that in 1835 and before humans had no impact on the landscape. On the contrary, this land was a human cultivated landscape for sure. The Native Americans had very sophisticated land management practices that they were implementing on the land. And their largest impact to the landscape was the annual fires that they were setting every fall. This annual burning was implemented at such a large scale that the fire could be seen from horizon to horizon. And without that fire, at least in the Chicago area, our forests would have looked more like eastern forests, and they would have been comprised of maples, beech, and other mesophytic trees, and but been a much more dense wooded canopy. So their management created a fire-dependent natural community, but also a natural community that was dependent upon human-set fire. So they were influencing the landscape for sure, like I said. So in the wake of the clearing fires that they had sent, they were also cultivating the landscape by planting, seeding, coppicing to create rich food plots for both the food plots in the forests and that would be for themselves, but then also for the wildlife that they were hunting. For example, they were moving around oak acorns, American chestnut, raspberries, blackberries, wild plum, and distributing those throughout the landscape. And so because Native Americans were conducting this large-scale land management, including the fires that they set, Illinois had 22 million acres of prairie and 14 million acres of woodlands and forests. So it must have been magnificent to see the rolling hills with the wild prairie grasses and the flowers growing. And since I can only imagine what beauty that had, I will let Ellen Bigelow, an early settler from Illinois at that time, Illinois, the prairie state in 1835, say her words. So nothing can equal the surpassing beauty of the rounded swells and the sunny hollows, the brilliant greens of the grass, the numberless varieties and the splendid hues of the multitudes of flowers. I gaze in admiration too strong for words. So that must have been a magnificent landscape. So unfortunately, shortly after Ellen had made her comments, the plow was invented in 1837. So things took a dramatic turn for the worse. In Illinois, much of the prairie, and I believe the entire Midwest, was converted into a farm field. So today we have lost 99.99% of all prairies in Illinois. That means that only 0.01% remain. Not only that, our hydrology has been greatly manipulated. Drain tiles were installed, and so all of the wetlands were drained as well. In and around the Chicago area, all the woodlands, not all of them, but nearly all of the woodlands were clear cut, making plank roads for moving the commerce that was happening, for building homes and the like. And we lost today we've lost 80% of our oak woodlands. Okay, now we are going to go back to current day times to discuss a couple more threats that we're dealing with in today's time. So obviously things have fundamentally changed. We've lost millions upon millions of acres of natural areas. And a lot of the natural areas that are left over, they're so small that we call them postage stamps. They are also chopped into smaller and smaller pieces, creating fragmentation. This creates smaller and smaller pieces of core habitat, increased edge, and increased invasive species pressure. So likely not knowing, the early settlers also were suppressing the fires that the Native Americans were setting. And that fire suppression continues through today. And in a fire-dependent ecosystem, this is spelling disaster in many regards. So fire does many things, but one of the biggest things that it does is it rebalances the woody species versus the herbaceous species. So just to be clear, in our local oak woodland ecosystems and in our prairies, more trees is not better in most cases. So for our oak woodlands, if we have too many trees and brush, we have less light hitting the ground floor in the woodlands. The less amount of light is less power for the wildflowers to grow, less power for the grasses. They're basically acting like little solar panels. And if they don't have that power, they can't produce the food that our pollinators need. And so we don't have pollinator food, we don't have insect food, we don't have bird food, and the food chain is broken, and so on. So one of the other critical things too is the white oak group, one of the major keystone species of our oak woodlands, needs a ton of light to get from an oak acorn to a seedling to a sapling and to a mature tree. A lot of our oak woodland forests have aging oak trees, and if they do not have someone to replace them, the entire ecosystem can blink out. The same goes for our prairies. If we don't have fire, we don't really have prairies. So historically, rain would have fallen onto our natural areas as well, and those deep-rooted prairie grasses in our prairies and the sedges in our woodlands would have been depositing vast organic matter in the soil, and that would have acted like sponges to soak the rain up, filter it, release it slowly into our wetlands and into our into our wetlands and into our streams. And that would have not only supported the hydraulic or the hydric communities and the aquatic communities that we have, but also it would have supported the prairies through drought periods, storing that vast amount of water and keeping our oak trees well watered throughout the summer as well. And so a stable and clean water table does many things besides just supporting plants. The stable water table and moisture in the soil, the specific gravity or the specific temperature of the water actually keeps the temperatures more stable, which actually supports a lot of insects that are reproducing below ground. And those then emerge and pollinate our flowers in our prairie, and it's full circle. However, today we have totally bypassed that natural system. We are, everybody knows that water is falling on buildings in our urban areas and suburban areas. It is then being shot straight into a parking lot, into the storm sewer, and then into our streams, which is quickly overwhelming them because they are not adapted to these huge volumes of flow. And that is creating the biology, not only the stream banks are failing, but also the biology within the streams is also failing. So we are losing our fish, our mussels, our invertebrates in the streams. And to add insult to injury, because the water is not being filtered, it's washing in pollutants like oil from cars, excess nutrients, salts, and the like. We also now have a global economy. And so non-native species are being introduced from the globe through industry, horticulture, agricultural, and cuisine. And non-native species aren't inherently bad, but when they are negatively affecting our natural areas, it is bad, and they definitely need to be dealt with for sure. We also have climate change, so weather patterns are more intense. I don't know if you guys had the same weather that we had here in Chicago during 2020, but we had some pretty intense rains through about mid-May. And then we went into an actual drought, and those stressors are acting upon our natural areas as well. So all of these things are adding up and compounding upon themselves, and it is adding up to habitat instability. Whoa, this stuff is pretty heavy. So at this point, you're probably saying, what is this guy talking about? Honestly, he is putting up Back to the Future memes, and this stuff has nothing to do with integrated pest management or plant selection. So I promise you we will get into that here shortly. But before we move into that, I wanted to comment on these things so that you were either reminded of where our landscapes came from, or you now know where our landscapes came from, where we're at today, to know where we want to move into the future. Okay, so finally, onto integrated pest management. So we have to rebuild our ecosystems from the ground up. So if you notice, this is the integrated pest management pyramid. It's represented in many ways. I like it represented in the pyramid form with the investigation, planning, and prevention on the bottom, cultural, then going to mechanical, biological, and chemical. And there's a reason why I read it in that order. The foundation is built from the ground up with the most important aspects of the integrated pest management pyramid being at the bottom. So first, what we need to do is talk about investigation, planning, and prevention to get that foundation built. So we always want to consider set the stage for the threats that I just mentioned. Those threats are the actual issue, with a lot of the other problems we're seeing in our natural areas being the symptoms from those issues. So if you can resolve those issues, a lot of the symptoms are much more easy to deal with. So investigation, planning, and prevention. So first, we want to identify communities that are represented at this moment in time. So this is a very broad brush look at a site to group either like communities or like threats to be able to deal with those in the future. So this is a project that I've worked on recently, and I just think it's a decent way to kind of explain some of these concepts. So first and foremost, if you have any remnant communities on site, you would want to protect those and buffer those first and foremost. If you're not familiar with what a remnant community is, think of a remnant community as a 1,000-year-old ecosystem, or thousands of years old, that contains vast riches of ecological wisdom that have been distilled through time, and resources that have aggregated over time. So these are really important. Some people might call these old growth woods, but also in the Midwest, we have old growth prairie and old growth wetlands, and a multitude of other ecosystems that can also have that old growth aspect to it. Secondly, so I guess those communities on this project here are indicated in green. Those are oak remnants, woodlands, so more old growth woodlands. We also have here in red, we have a post-settlement community that we call a unassociated second growth woodlands. This has grown up more recently in time, between the last 50 and 80 years. So what is a post-settlement community? This community has developed post-European settlement, so it has not had the time to develop the way that old growth forests have. And so they have not had time to develop what I call into an ecological masterpiece. So they do have value, but they are definitely not as valuable as an old growth, say, woods or remnant woods. So what else do we have on site here? We've got Up in the upper right-hand corner there, the northeast corner, that is in yellow, is a prairie recreation that was started 10 years ago. So we are obviously going to want to help protect that. We also have an agricultural field here in brown, which I consider to be basically a blank slate because it came out of agricultural production last year. So there's not really much on that. So one of the questions is that folks might be thinking of is, how do you know if a site has remnant qualities or not? So this is a 1939 aerial in the Chicago area, and I guess in other areas as well. We have a multitude of aerials to choose from, the oldest being the 1939. So it is nice to take a look at this to see what woody species were present or forests were present at that time. So what sticks out to me on this slide is the darker gray. So that is oak woodlands in the Chicago area. And because they were present in 1939, prior to many of the second growth forests having time to take off, that indicates that likely has a high ecological significance to it. It obviously needs to be ground truth to confirm that. But also what I see here is a patchwork of agricultural fields that would indicate that it likely has no ecological significance, or I should say little ecological significance, as opposed when comparing it to, say, a remnant community. So you may be able to find, say if you look kind of in this area here, there's a stream that's going through here. You might find some remnant sedge meadow along the stream. You also, if you find a remnant prairie, that would be the crown jewel to find, because like I said, there's only 0.01% of those remaining. So again, I want to identify the site that we're looking at on this map. So that is what we're looking at here in red. So let's zoom in a little bit more here and see what's going on. So the first thing that I notice when I zoom up here in this area here is that this was oak savanna. Notice how widely spaced these trees are. On a 1939 aerial, you can actually pick out individual trees. We also notice that because they are so widely spaced, think about how much light is streaming down to the ground here. One of the other communities that I would also like to pick out is this forest or woodland down at the bottom. Even though it is denser, it still has, if you can see that, there's open space where light is getting in. And so it still had pretty good light levels hitting the ground. And so that is what's important to note from this. So now what I'd like to do is a side-by-side comparison of the two. So if you can see on the right-hand side over here, there's a small group of trees. In the current day aerial from 2018, those trees are also represented on that map. On the 2018 aerial, you may see this home here. That would be located in this corner of the historic aerial from 1939. So now when you look at them compared side by side, you will notice the amount of trees that are present on the new aerial versus the old aerial. There's a much greater amount of trees choking out the oak woodlands. And the reason being, again, is that there was a stop to Native American set fires that actually let brush grow in to some extent. But then as soon as the Europeans moved in and those fires were stopped, they started to graze these areas with livestock. And that actually kept the brush suppressed all the way up and through about the 1940s, at which point the dairy industry and the livestock industry in the Chicago area started to dry up. And so a lot of people started pulling these animals off of the landscape, which allowed the brush to creep in. So that's why a lot of the second growth forests really only started to appear since about the 1940s, 50s, and the like. So, okay, so one other thing I wanted to take a look at was soil maps. So soil maps can also help you zone into potentially hydric soils. Those would be wetlands, to woodland soils. Obviously, those would be woodlands and prairie soils. So that may help you map out your different communities in your landscape based on the formation of soils, which gives you also another glimpse into history and lets you kind of identify current or future communities. One other thing that the soil community that can help you do is if you are disabling drain tiles and trying to restore hydrology, these can help somewhat predict future hydrology based on that, but not exactly. So you got to take that with a grain of salt. Okay, so now we know our pre-settlement communities. We now know the current state of our remnant communities, that they have too many trees in this particular instance, too much brush, invasive brush, and the like. We've identified more novel ecosystems such as the agricultural field potentially and the native restoration in the upper right-hand corner. And so that is basically the investigation phase. You've done your investigation, you know the current state of things. So the next step is prevention and planning. And so if you're in the Midwest and you want to identify those threats, I don't know if you guys are aware of this book, but this is called the Chicago Wilderness Biodiversity Recovery Plan. Again, this is specific to Chicago, but this has a wealth of knowledge about identifying communities and identifying specific threats against those community types. So again, this is for Chicago, but I believe it is applicable to the Midwest. If you want this free, it is a free publication. You can go to the link at the bottom of the page. For those who may have some challenges in identifying communities or threats against those communities, this is an excellent resource. So it's a launching point to at least get you started. So again, here, let's talk about what we have. So we have the oak communities in green. So we want to identify the threat there. So we have honeysuckle. We also have a lot of what we call weedier or less fire tolerant species that have grown up over time. The mitigating action for that would be to remove those and dispose of those. We also have a decent herbaceous layer in here. And so as long as we get the light regime correct, that herbaceous layer should be able to heal itself. The oak community should be able to heal itself on its own. So we likely will not need seed in here. Let's go to the second growth woodland indicated in red. Again, this is a mishmash of things that have unassociated growth that have grown in over the last 50 years. Invasive species, we would want to address those by removing them. Also, we have overstocked mesophytic native trees such as wild cherry or something like that. And so getting this to a burnable landscape is one of the most important things. And so you want to set a prescription in here to get you to a point where you can get wildflowers and grasses growing on the ground to establish that fuel so that you can manage these with any ease, and to make sure that you're setting the stage for pollinators to be able to grow on the ground so we can, or I'm sorry, for wildflowers to be able to grow on the ground so we can support our wildflower or pollinators that keep mixing those up. So this area does not have a oak overstory. It does not have native shrubs. It does not have a great herbaceous layer. And so we would want to augment that area with all of those. Now let's take a look at the agricultural field. Again, this is pretty much a blank slate, so it has no native species to be able to recover from. So it is going to need seed and plants. Also, it probably has altered hydrology, like I said, with drain tiles installed. If you were taking that on, you would want to disable those at this point. The formerly restored prairie up in the upper right-hand corner, it has a little bit of invasive brush creeping in, so you might want to mow that and then get it back in a burnable state. One of the overriding things that I said is the lack of fire. And so when you're designing all of these ecosystems, you want to choose your species and your communities to make those burnable. This is more appropriate for probably medium to large scale restorations, but it is also applicable to small scale applications as long as you're able to implement controlled burning. So the next step after we have done the investigation, planning, and prevention is cultural. Cultural in natural areas management, at least the way that I see it, is developing the best augmentation using native plants possible. So one of the first things you need to do is you need to know your community. The bare minimum, at least in knowing your community, is to know the moisture regime and the light regime to at least get you started here. So what I like to do is to start with turf grass. A lot of people are really familiar with that. If you have turf grass growing in an area, typically that is more normal soil moisture. You can kind of tend a little bit drier. That might be dry mesic. You can tend a little bit wetter. That would be wet mesic. So on the far left-hand side of your screen, we've got the native prickly pear cactus that might grow on a dry hill prairie or a gravel hill prairie. And so that is probably one of the most driest ends of the spectrum, at least in the Chicago area. And then if you tend to the right of your screen, looking at the red cardinal flower there, that might be wet prairie, and then grading down into a cattails there in a marsh situation. So also you need to look at the light regime. So full sun is typically considered 6+ hours of full sun. So think of a prairie, it's treeless largely, that is getting full sun all day long. Part sun, 4 to 6 hours. Think of the savanna that we looked at. Largely it's full sun, but at certain points of the day, some of those individual trees might be blocking some light. Shade dappled all day. Think of the woodland that I showed on the 1939 aerial, where you still have gaps in the canopy and light is getting in there for sure. And then anything lower light levels than that, typically, at least in the Chicago area, are not natural light. So basically deep shade, or going into what I call pitch black, or think of the north side of a building. So those are not natural, and so those are really difficult to get native plants to grow in, just because they weren't natural back in the day. Okay, so cultural again. So getting back to our project here, so let's take a look at the agricultural field. So in blue here, we have full sun, wet soils. So let's call this a sedge meadow, potentially grading into an emergent wetland. So here we would want to use seed and live plugs. The area in yellow, we have full sun, normal soil moisture. So this is a mesic shortgrass prairie, or possibly a mesic tallgrass prairie here. We would likely use a seed mix. In the oak woodlands, like I mentioned, we have a healthy overstory canopy. We do have some, to some extent, we have an herbaceous native layer that's in there. And so as long as we get the proper light regime, we get controlled burning and the proper management back in there, we believe that that can heal on its own, and it likely does not warrant native seed or plants. So now looking at the second growth woods in red, again, here, as long as we implement the thinning that we had talked about to get the proper light levels back in, we would want to introduce seed and live plants back into this area. So this is normal soils. We would want to call this maybe a mesic oak woodland here. Okay, so looking at the recreated prairie, this is full sun and potentially normal soils likely. We would want to potentially put some plugs in here as well to maybe diversify it. Okay, so now that we've identified our general communities, we would like to, and we know where we want these communities to move to. We need to come up with a more specific actual species list for these communities. So the best way to do this is to reference remnant plant communities. And the reason why we reference a remnant plant community is those have evolved over thousands of years, like I said, and whittled away the plants that don't work, and they've only distilled themselves down to the plants that do work in those communities. So recognize that those developed at a time that is different than today. So these are a reference. They're not necessarily hard and fast. You can and may need to do some tweaking to get them to work in today's environment, but they are a great starting point. So one thing that I would like to mention is that botanists have studied remnant ecosystems, and they've noticed a pattern that if you typically have the same geology, the same moisture, the same soils, et cetera, and you have a community over here, community one, the plants that associate in community one, if you were to put the same geology, soil moisture, and everything else in another location, virtually everything is the same, that you would find the same plant community in that second location. And what we call those plants that tend to associate together, it seems pretty easy, but they're called associates. And so the king of associates, at least in the Chicago area, is a book called The Flora of the Chicago Region. And so this book, like I mentioned before, is developed for Chicago, but my understanding is that it is applicable and used across much of the Midwest. And so the way that you would want to use this plant, or this book, I'm sorry, is you would first start with an insert that's in there. It's a geology map. You would generally look at, hey, what county am I in, or what corner of the county am I in? What is my general geology of the area? You would then look up the keystone species. So let's use our oak woodland, for example. The keystone species in that would be a white oak. So we look up Quercus alba. We look underneath that species for the correct community type with the associated geology. And then there they would list all of the associate plant, or not all of them, but a lot of associate plants with that white oak particular to that community. So for example, white oak may have an associate of oak sedge, Carex pennsylvanica, shooting star, and sideflower aster, and so on and so on. And that is how restoration ecologists develop species lists for sites. So this may be overly specific for your site, but if you do have a remnant or you're doing a large scale restoration, I believe it does warrant this detail of investigation. If you don't have any remnant qualities, or you're doing a smaller scale restoration, similar to what they were talking about in the previous presentation, is that you can use the Cliff Notes, basically a pre-designed seed mix for your particular site. So an ecologist has already done this for you, and those generalist species mixes work well for those particular communities. So seed mix is typically the backbone of your effort. It's going to provide most of the diversity. It's also going to provide most of the cover for the ground. But in certain circumstances, you may want to pair these with live planting. So one example would be a wetland. You may want to introduce species that either are not available by seed, they are mostly spreading vegetatively, or you may want to plant because, hey, if you threw seed in, it may wash downstream if you're doing a stream restoration or a wetland. And so you may only be stuck with using plants. A second example would be the oak, or maybe the second growth community, where you could throw down a seed to kind of get some generalist species in there, but maybe a lot of the spring ephemerals aren't available by seed, or they're exceedingly expensive. Or another one that is a super important species is Carex pennsylvanica. It is one of the most important plants that you can get back into your oak woodlands. If you ever have time, please look up that species in that Flora of the Chicago region. It's got an entire page on the importance of that and how it connects insects to its importance, and how it holds the water in the ground, kind of some of the stuff that I was talking about before. So I'm not going to get into this too much, but because stream restoration would be an entire presentation in and of itself. But recognize that there is a third dimension to the stream restoration, in that it's got flowing water and scour acting on it. So if you look at where the folks are planting plants here, that's the deposition side. Across the way is the cut bank. So even if you had on both banks the same light and the same hydrology, there's different forces acting on each side. And so you'd need to design a different seed mix for those. Okay, so now I'm going to get into warrior plants here. So these, so number one, you want to get the correct seed into your natural areas. Like I said, that is what's going to cover the ground the most. But you may want to deploy plants strategically using live plants into certain areas that may require them. And the reason why you want to be so specific with plants is they are exceedingly more expensive than seed is. And also, when you're putting them in, you want to put them into the proper area so you're not losing them because you planted them in the wrong location. So why do I call these warrior plants? Well, I call them warrior plants because these are like the Navy SEALs. You want to deploy them only when necessary, and strategically deploy these into highly specialized communities. So again, these would typically be really aggressive grasses, sedges, typically used in your wetlands. And why you would use them there is they spread through their roots, forming sods to help combat against invasive species, which is going to help reduce erosion, particularly in streams, but also it's going to help you reduce your herbicide use. and make a stronger, more resilient community that you can let cook on its own, I guess, for lack of a better term. So I have developed through many, many projects that I have done, various species lists for communities, at least in the Chicago area. And I believe Lori has posted this on the summit page, but there are links to each one of these community types with their specified species list. The only one that's not up there is the oak woodland. And like I said before, I would say its warrior plant is Carex pennsylvanica. Okay, so now that we've done the investigation, planning, and prevention, we've done the cultural, we are on to the maintenance side of things in using mechanical. So what does mechanical mean in natural areas restoration? Well, largely it means mowing for year 1, 2, potentially up to year 3, which helps cut back on the weeds. It also gets light down to your native seedlings to help them establish. It also cuts down on the weed seed production. So I don't focus a lot on the maintenance side of things. I believe there's a lot of publications that do focus on this. I focused on the foundation of the pyramid because I believe there is not as much focus on how the industry, at least in the Chicago area, does that type of work. So, so once you've kind of got your things established, you may want to move from straight out broadcast mowing. In year 2, you may want to move towards more spot mowing with either brush cutters or tractor, depending on the scale of your site. When you're in year 3, you typically would have enough fuels established where you want to start controlled burning. Controlled burning, for better or worse, what I mentioned before is that it is going to help rebalance woody species versus herbaceous species. So if you've planted native woody species and they are not established yet, they usually need to get quite established before just running a fire through them, that you're going to want to protect around those to make sure you're not killing the plants you just planted. So we're not going to get into chemical or biological very much, but what I would mention about those is that if you do need to use them, you need to move away from them as quickly as possible. And you need to start over with the investigation, planning, and prevention phase to figure out what went wrong in that location. So did you use plants that didn't work? You just need to start the whole process over and start putting more native plants and seed back in there to move away from chemical and biological. Okay, the last point that I would like to make is the flywheel concept. So I believe this is one of the single most important concepts that I can convey to people. A lot of times when I see municipalities, land managers, homeowners, even farmers doing CRP lands where they lack, is they'll do the first couple years of maintenance, but then they stop doing the maintenance because they feel like it's established. So if you don't use the flywheel concept to continue and build your momentum the way that a flywheel does, that you will probably most likely end up in failure, either with the system not being well established or it getting consumed by invasive species. So what is a flywheel? If you're not familiar with that, take a look at the picture here at how big that is versus the gentleman that's standing there. Think about how heavy that would be if it's made totally out of steel. It takes a lot of force, a lot of pushes, a lot of work to get it moving. You've got one push, it gets maybe just a slightly rotating. Another push, you might get one rotation out of it. But every time you push this flywheel, it builds and builds and builds momentum. So with momentum built, it becomes harder and harder to stop it. So if you take that concept and you apply it to integrated pest management, one push of the wheel would be investigation, planning, and prevention. The next push would be plant and seed. The next push would be burn and mow. The next push would be evaluation of the site. And then you start the whole loop again. That would be one season. The second season, you keep on pushing the wheel. You get one rotation, two rotations, three rotations, you're building momentum, 5 rotations, 10, 100, 1,000. Once you get to 1,000 years, I guess I can let you take a break because you've probably built a relatively resilient ecosystem at that point. The point being, the more and more you implement the flywheel concept in combination with integrated pest management, the more resiliency you build, the more that it can support local pollinators, the more that it is able to be resilient to invasion from invasive species, the more core habitat you build up, the better your ecosystem is going to be. So what I want to say in conclusion is that you need to start and again, building that foundation from the ground up. If you need assistance in doing that, or plant design, invasive species control, some of this stuff is relatively complicated, particularly on larger sites or when you get into stream restoration and wetland and hydrology. I just wanted to mention that we're here for you on those. We love this stuff. We believe it is critical not only to wildlife habitat, but also to mankind. So we offer these things for free to make sure that you are successful in your restoration projects.